Hello, fellow book readers. My name is John, and today we are going to go over part 2 of my top 50 short story list. So I did part 1 last week, and that included numbers 50 through number 41. And today I'm going to go over number 40 through number 31. So these are my 31st through number 40 favorite short stories I've ever read. Now, do remember that this list is going to skew a bit towards the fantasy side, because I am more of a fantasy reader than I am a reader of other genres, but there's definitely a good mix here of genres of short stories. With that being said, I will include the title of the story, a small blurb or description about the story, what year it was published, and where you can find it today. If you can, if you have to find it in a book. There's some classics here that you can just find online. I'm not going to talk about where you can find them. I will link part 1 down below. But for now, let's get started with story number 40. And that would be The Wilding by Jane Yolen. That was originally published in 1995 in an anthology known as The Starfarer's Dozen. It is more commonly found today in The Midnight Circus, which is a collection of Jane Yolen short stories that focus on dark theming or paranormal theming, or they're just darker, edgier short stories is what I'm trying to say. So this story is about a girl and her friends who go to Central Park, where there is this thing called Wilding, and it's sort of like an amusement ride, not an amusement ride, but sort of like a theme park, I would say, where you can go through this entryway, and sort of magic transforms you into an animal. So it's really like a shapeshifter story, and I love it because I like things like werewolves and stuff like that. And this story, while it isn't a werewolf story, I would call it werewolf adjacent. And of course, with werewolves and shapeshifting comes death and fighting and stuff like that. Now, they're not supposed to do that type of stuff in Central Park while undergoing this process called wilding, which is the process known as transformation or shapeshifting. But that type of stuff does happen here on occasion. It is, not legal, and there are consequences if it does happen, but in this story, stuff like that does take place. And that is the blurb for the story. You'll have to read it all to figure out what happens at the end, but it's very good with sort of a twist ending, I would say. I do like that there's a little hope sprinkled in the story. And like I said, I just think the magic here is really cool, and the shape-shifting aspect is awesome. Okay, next up at number 39 is Percy Jackson and the Sword of Hades by Riordan. This story is, of course, a Percy Jackson short story, originally published in the Demigod Files in 2009. The story centers around Percy Jackson, Thalia, and Nico, who you all meet in the original Percy Jackson 5-book series. And they are summoned by Persephone to the underworld to retrieve Hades' sword, which has been stolen. Of course, if Hades' sword is not found, a lot of bad stuff is going to happen. Really great story. It captures the humor and wit of the Percy Jackson novels, in a shorter length, and I think that works really well. I think Percy Jackson was almost written to be short story, to be able to be used in short stories. That style of writing works really well in short stories, and this short story does what Percy Jackson does so well. It teaches you a little bit about mythology while also bringing action and humor and some really good world building to the forefront. The climax of this is really brilliant as well. Just a great short story. Really loved it. Riordan is a fantastic writer, whether it's novels or short stories. He has a bunch of short stories out there that are Percy Jackson adjacent, so do check them out if you get a chance. This is my favorite of the bunch, though. Okay, number 38 is Requiem, Antartica by Jane Yolen. It was originally published in 2000 in Asimov's science fiction magazine, but again, it is better found today in the 2020 short story collection known as The Midnight Circus, which is just all Jane Yolen stories. This is a story about a vampire who goes on an expedition to Antarctica to to claim new land for the British. Of course, he has alternative reasons for being there, and ultimately he wants to end the vampire curse. Really great story with a very good twist ending. It's a bit long. It's on the long side for a short story, but it makes for some really good world building, and it of course has some really good vampire lore. Just a really fantastic short story. It is my favorite short story that focuses on vampires. Like, where the primary character is a vampire, this would be my favorite short story. I've read a lot of great vampire novels, but in terms of short stories, this one takes the cake for me. Okay, coming in at number 37 is The Weaver of Tomorrow by Jane Yolen. Yes, there is a lot of Jane Yolen on this list. I think Jane Yolen is a fantastic short story writer. The story was originally published in 1974 in her first ever published book of short stories known as The Girl Who Cried Flowers. It is the book that launched her career. This is the standout story from that. It is a dark fairy tale about a girl named Vera who wants to learn about the future, and so she becomes an apprentice to the Weaver. And what she learns from the Weaver is that all futures lead to death, and it's sort of a circular motion. And of course, being the apprentice to the Weaver, she learns about how to read people's futures, but it's not exactly a happy end. But it's not a sad end either. It's sort of the theme I would say is like life. There's a beginning and there's an end, and it's sort of circular. All things come back to the beginning. Really great short story. It definitely has that fairy tale vibe that you look for in like older fairy tales where they're like a little bit darker. Really hit the nail on the head with it. I really enjoyed it. There's just sort of like a magic in the air about the story that I think works really well. Yeah, I was a big fan of it. It's quite a quick read too. It's a short story. So there's that. And I think the main character is just very easy to root for. Okay, next up at number 36 is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, originally published in a 1973 anthology, science fiction anthology titled New Dimensions 3. You can easily just find this story online, so you don't have to go out and find that book today. It's a story about this like beautiful sort of utopian style city that is only able to stay that way through the torture of a child. So an innocent child has to just be tortured for life to be beautiful and happy in this city. It's very unfair and very cruel, and it's about the people that walk away from the city when they know the secret, which isn't really a secret. It's an open secret. Everybody knows about it. Some people don't care, but the people that do care walk away. And that is sort of the story here. And I think it just has some really powerful theming that is very interesting about guilt and justice and injustice and things like that, and the price of freedom almost. So yeah, it's interesting. Really tugs on like critical thinking, and I think it's just written really well. I won't say it's the happiest story of all time. It definitely isn't, but it's a very interesting story, and it's classic for a reason. Yeah, so it's going to land at number 36 for me. Really, really good story. One of the fewer science fiction stories on my list, but there are a few, and this is definitely one of them. Okay, number 35 is Guardians by George R. R. Martin, first published in his 1986 fix-up novel known as Tough Voyaging. This, of course, stars the character Tough. This is another science fiction short story. One of the, like I said, there's not that many on this list, but back-to-back science fictions here. This one is about Tough, who visits this oceanic world where sort of an apocalypse is going on almost, where these sea creatures are just all of a sudden attacking humans and sort of like mass exterminating them. And nobody can figure out why, so they're hiring Tough Voyage, or Tough himself, to figure out a way to fix this. Now, of course, it's not that easy, because Tough doesn't just do things instantly. He has to figure out the problem itself, and figuring out the problem, of course, involves watching what's happening and studying the creatures of the planet and things like that. Because Tough himself is a ecological engineer who, studies nature and sort of things like that. So he can figure out stuff like this, but it does require him to actually study the planet, because all planets are different, right? But of course, for some people on the planet, that's not good enough. They need it solved instantly. So, of course, misadventure happens, and when it looks like all hope will be lost. But I'm not going to spoil the end. It's a really great story with a really great end. George has always written like very hopeful pieces that are dark. So they're both dark and hopeful. He's like the master of doing that. And this is no different. The character of Tough, not one of my favorite George R. R. Martin characters, but in this story in particular, it really works. This is my favorite of the Tough voyaging stories. I love his spaceship. The spaceship is sort of like a character of its own. Of course, there's multiple different characters here. It all works. There's some really, really fabulous world building. George is a master world builder, even in short stories. I can't recommend reading George R. R. Martin short fiction enough. He's a master short storyteller, and there are numerous George R. R. Martin short stories coming up on this list. So do keep that in mind. But if you're going to read Tough Voyaging, make sure you read this one. This is my favorite of the 6 Tough stories. Okay, at number 34 is Good Hunting by Ken Liu. This is a genre blender. It's, part science fiction, part folklore, part fantasy. Short stories tend to be genre blenders on occasion, but this one really breaks the bank on just trying to mishmash all these genres together, and it works. It worked really well. Ken Liu is a master at doing that. He has done it all throughout his career, and in this story, I think it highlights his skill at doing that sort of genre blending. The story is about a girl and a boy who meet, and one's sort of like a spirit, and the other's a physical person, and they undergo sort of these trials and tribulations to see how their life progresses. And of course, one becomes half robot, and the other one becomes more involved with agriculture and things like that. And it's really steampunk meets just old China, and it worked out really well. It has a fabulous ending that really shows the danger of sort of modernization and industrialization is the word I was looking for, sorry. And then of course how unknown the future is, and I think that's really a good point here. We don't know what the future holds, and it could be very dangerous. It's a tale of caution, and I think short stories do a really good job with that. There's a lot of short stories with the tales with the moral of the story is to be cautious, and I think that's the moral of the story here in a lot of different ways. I think the 2 main characters are very easy to root for, even as the one sort of succumbs to sort of, I won't say evil, but sort of corruption almost. Yeah, just a really interesting story. Really enjoyed it. You can find it in the Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, which was published in 2016. And this won't be the only Ken Liu story on the list, just in case you're wondering. Okay, the next story is called Little Girl Lost by Charles de Lint, which was first published in the short story collection known as Firebird's Rising. This story is interesting because this was eventually turned into a full-length novel. I have not read the full-length novel, so I can't compare the short story to the full-length novel and tell you which one's better, but I really like the short story. Of course, it's based sort of on fairy tales where these garden gnomes are alive, right? Except in this case, it's not garden gnomes, it's just very, very, very small people. And of course, this teenager becomes friends with this orphaned girl, little person. And it's sort of a coming of age story for both of them. Of course, the main plot of the story is the little girl goes missing, and they try to find her and figure out what's happened. It has a really charming end to it, and the story just has this sort of magic in the air about it that you find in fairy tales, which I really enjoy, and I thought it was done really well here. Charles de Lint is a great author in terms of prose and wordsmith. Yeah, just really fantastic story, and it lands at number 32 for me. Sorry, I mean 33. Okay, at number 32 is Portraits of His Children by George R. R. Martin. This was published in 1987 in his short story collection known as Portraits of His Children and Other Stories. This story rules. It's about an author who gets a painting from his daughter featuring one of his characters, and of course that character later comes to life. It starts off as sort of this author thinks his daughter's trying to like get revenge on him, so it starts off sort of as a revenge story, and then it turns into a bit of a horror story, and then it sort of shifts to sort of a, I would say, fantasy almost. Really interesting genre blender. George R. R. Martin is great at that, but it hits all the nails on the head in like all three of those things, and the magic here is really cool, kind of creepy, but really awesome in a different way. It's also the moral of the story is like our main character, the author himself, is rethinking his life choices as each of his characters come to life. It sort of has like Christmas Carol vibes to it in terms of like the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, except in this case it's like the characters he wrote actually coming to life. Very, very, very interesting with a really, really great end. George usually nails the ending to his story, and this is no exception. I like the story a lot. I read it in Dream Songs Volume 2. It's the closing story in that novel. Just awesome, awesome, awesome stuff. So if I were you, I would not try to go get Portraits of His Children, the anthology novel. Instead, I would just buy Dream Songs Volume 2, which has a bunch of different George R. R. Martin short stories in it that was published in the early 2000s, including this one, and this is probably the highlight story of the bunch in Volume 2. Well, probably the Hedge Knight is, but after the Hedge Knight, it would be this. And okay, the final story in part 2 of this list is number 31, Babbity, Rabbity, and Her Cackling Stump by J.K. Rowling, which was, of course, included in her 2008 short story collection known as The Tale of Beetle the Bard. I really like the story. It's about a king who bans magic, but is also just like jealous of magic, so he's trying to learn magic, and he hires somebody to teach him magic, but of course that person that teaches him magic can't do magic. But of course there are people hiding in his court that can do magic, and they sort of teach him a lesson. And yeah, it's just one of those stories that has like a really good moral to it. It's very short. All the short stories in this collection are very short, but this one is probably like 15 pages, 80, less than that. It's really, really, really short. Just a great story with like a really good lesson at the end of it. And I love short stories that like kind of teach you a lesson. This one's definitely aimed for children, but you can read it as an adult. It still stands up. It reads kind of like a fantasy mixed with a fairy tale. And fairy tales are sort of a subgenre of fantasy, but this sort of leads as sort of like, think Harry Potter style fantasy, but also like fairy tale sort of mixed together, and it works really well. J.K. Rowling's definitely not known for her short stories, but there are a few in this collection that really stand out to me. This is one of them. Okay, and that is it for part 2 of this list. We are going to get to some stories that are more well-known in part 3, because that's when the classics really start to come into play more. But here in this list, we got some really great ones. It's a really good blend of fantasy, science fiction, and sort of fairy tales, I think, in part 2. But I can't wait to share part 3 with you all. As always, let me know down below what short stories you love, if you've read any of these. And as always, thanks for watching.